Today I feel that I need to discuss the pro-choice versus pro-life debate because the facts matter. So please buckle in and let's begin. In the USA, women's rights seem to be taking a step backwards. You may have heard about the controversial overturning of the Roe versus Wade case, which is a real step backwards for women's rights. And let's be clear, women's rights are fairly new in the USA, which has been backward in terms of women's rights for many hundreds of years. Women have had to fight really long, hard battles to gain the rights that they have there, and now on a very important piece of legislation, they are going backwards. This doesn't bode well for the USA. So let's look at what happened. On Friday, June the 24th, 2022, the U.S. Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade, the landmark piece of legislation that made access to an abortion a federal right in the United States. The decision dismantled 50 years of legal protection and paved the way for individual states to curtail or outright ban abortion rights. So, Roe versus Wade is quite a complex case and was heard in 1973. It was a landmark decision of the U.S. Supreme Court in which the court ruled that the Constitution of the United States conferred the right to have an abortion. The decision struck down many federal and state abortion laws and caused an ongoing abortion debate in the United States about whether or to what extent abortion should be legal, who should decide the legality of abortion, and what the role of moral and religious views in the political sphere should be. The decision also shaped debate concerning which methods the Supreme Court should use in constitutional adjudication. The case was brought by Norma McCorvey, known by the legal pseudonym Jane Roe, who in 1969 became pregnant with her third child. McCorvey wanted an abortion, but she lived in Texas where abortion was illegal, except when necessary to save the mother's life, that is. Her attorneys, Sarah Weddington and Linda Coffey, filed a lawsuit on her behalf in U.S. federal court against her local district attorney, Henry Wade, alleging that Texas abortion laws were unconstitutional. A special three-judge court of the U.S. District Court for the Northern District of Texas heard the case and ruled in her favor. The parties appealed this ruling to the Supreme Court. On January 22, 1973, the Supreme Court issued a 7-2 decision holding that the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment to the United States Constitution provides a fundamental right to privacy, which protects a pregnant woman's right to an abortion. The court also held that the right to abortion is not absolute and must be balanced against the government's interest in protecting women's health and prenatal life. The court resolved these competing interests by announcing a pregnancy trimester timetable to govern all abortion regulations in the United States. The court also classified the right to abort as fundamental, which required courts to evaluate challenging abortion laws under the strict scrutiny standard, the most stringent level of a judicial review in the United States. So the question is really, why do men want to control women's reproductive choices? Why is termination of pregnancy such a contentious thing, and why are women being denied the right to determine what happens to their own bodies by men in positions of power? What is this really all about? Feminist scholars have argued that men's control over women's reproductive autonomy is a central feature of male dominance. Building on recent research that shows sexist ideology informs support for restricting women's reproductive autonomy, we examined the relation of sexism and the belief that men should be able to restrict the behavior of women. This whole view that men can restrict women in any way is an extremely outdated and toxic concept that men don't seem to have surpassed even after years of women's rights being front and foremost of discussion. Hostile sexism was related to support for men having the right to prevent their pregnant partner from having an abortion. But hostile sexism was also related to the endorsement of men's right to withdraw financial support for the child if a woman chooses not to terminate her pregnancy. So men can't really seem to make a decision. They're unhappy either way, and they still feel they have a right to determine what women do with their bodies. Hostile sexism was also uniquely related to support for men's right to veto their female partners' decisions during pregnancy and childbirth. The present studies show that hostile sexism is associated with perceptions that men have the right to constrain women's reproductive choices. I find this absolutely unacceptable, that men believe that they can control what women do and that they actually have the right to do this. It's actually abhorrent. Control over women. Women can control their reproductive lives without access to abortion. They can do so by refraining from sexual intercourse. This stunning statement was written in a Friend of the Court brief submitted to the Supreme Court in July by Texas Right to Life and signed by Jonathan Mitchell, one of the architects of Texas Law SB 8. And it makes crystal clear that outlawing abortion isn't the only end game. Control over women is. What makes this so disturbing is you don't see women telling men how to handle their bodies, yet men and some women seem to feel that they can do this with women. Why is that? Ruth Bader Ginsburg explained to the Senate Judiciary Committee, the decision whether or not to bear a child is central to a woman's life, to her well-being and dignity. It is a decision that only she can make for herself. When government controls that decision for her, she's being treated as less than a fully adult human, responsible for her own choices. This view that men are somehow more competent at making decisions is outdated, archaic, and untrue. We only have to look at the state of the world to see that really men are the last people in many cases that should be running the show, because they cause devastation and chaos, and they just aren't capable in many instances of doing a good job. So why should they be in control over women's bodies? They shouldn't. That's the answer. Throughout modern history, government control over women's bodies, and by extension women, has been a prevalent theme built into our very systems. Rape was initially deemed a property crime against the victim's father, and as property themselves, married women couldn't own property under the common law principle of coverture. States gradually granted property ownership to married women, though, in 1943. To keep women in their place and thus out of power, American laws long forbade women from full societal participation. In 1948, the Supreme Court affirmed women couldn't be big city bartenders unless their father or husband owned the establishment. Only in 1973 could women serve on a jury in all 50 states, and until 1974, women without their husband's permission could be refused credit cards. It's hugely surprising to me that women aren't handing in their American passports and leaving these people in a world without women. It certainly seems to be the only way for certain men to get the message that we are not their property. Is the USA advanced, or are we being fooled? You know, often the USA is touted as such a fantastic country to live in, but more and more we seem to be seeing all the evidence saying the exact opposite. Actually, the USA appears advanced, but honestly it isn't. And the fact that men in the USA think women's rights and autonomy is a joke is a prime illustration of this very fact, in my opinion. The real shocker is that some of these misogynistic men actually have wives. The fact that they are misogynistic should really condemn them to be single and not have the ability to enjoy female company. Because if you have such disrespect for women, then you shouldn't actually have the right to their company. Furthermore, when any male has to carry a baby for 9 months, go through labor pains, and push a 5-kilogram child out of his private parts, at that point women might give men the time of day when it comes to telling them what they should do with their wombs. But let's face it, if men could give birth, they wouldn't have kids because the labor pains alone would put them off. So let's examine the differences between the pro-life and pro-choice groups, shall we? Pro-choice emphasizes a woman's right to bodily autonomy and control over her body. Pro-life positions argue that a fetus is a human deserving of legal protection and separate from the will of the mother. Pro-choice says women should be able to have the choice about what happens to their bodies after all their lives are impacted by pregnancy. People who are pro-choice believe that individuals have unlimited autonomy with respect to their own reproductive systems, as long as they don't breach the autonomy of others. A comprehensive pro-choice position asserts that the following must remain legal: celibacy and abstinence, contraception use, emergency contraception use, abortion, and childbirth. On the other side of the equation, the pro-lifers believe that the government has an obligation to preserve all human life, regardless of intent, viability, or quality of life concerns. They don't care about quality of life of the child after it's born. All they care about is that the child is born, which I think is a fatal flaw in the mix. A comprehensive pro-life ethic, such as that proposed by the Roman Catholic Church, prohibits abortion, euthanasia and assisted suicide, the death penalty, and war, with very few exceptions. The fact that these people believe that they can tell a person what they can and can't do with the life that they've been given by God is absolutely mind-blowing to me. The fact that they believe that they can step in and tell somebody how to conduct their life is absolutely unacceptable. So let's look at the state interfering with women's choices. The issue is partially that a child is a financial and emotional responsibility for a parent for many years, a thing that many women just aren't prepared to take on, and many men can't afford to take on. But more than this, in many cases, women's lives are really at risk during the pregnancy. If the pregnancy is not unsafe for the mom and the state fights for the birth of the child, then I would hold that the state should care for and nurture the child and provide for all a child's needs to adulthood and pay for the tertiary education of the child. The state should also be able to be sued if the child is abused or neglected in any way in the state's care, and the state should be held to the same child care standards that they hold parents to. The state should also fund whatever procedures women need to attain a pre-pregnancy body and state of health. If the state is going to interfere in women's reproductive choices, then the state must accept the responsibility for children that are born which women don't want to have. I'm now going to talk a little bit about children that are born that are orphans. We have an incredibly large orphan population in the world, and it's disturbing to me that people are campaigning for the life of fetuses, but they give no thought to the quality of life of the fetus after birth, or the mental and physical health of the mom after birth. The fact is that there are some women who are just not mentally and physically capable of being moms, and forcing them to give birth is not going to create good outcomes for either the mom or the child. I know someone like this, and her being a mom has actually done more damage to her child than if she had not been able to have children. So I think that there needs to be an evaluation of, will a child be best served by being born to that person. So what are my beliefs? Well, I believe that the child has a right to a good life. So if you're poor and struggling as a parent or have mental health issues, I really feel like you shouldn't be allowed to breed. It's very unfair to the child. And why do I say poor people shouldn't breed? Well, for me it's quite simple. They bring these poor kids into a life of poverty and struggle, which really isn't fair to the child. And if they cared about the child at all, they wouldn't breed. It's not fair to bring a new life into a life of poverty and struggle where you can't provide for their basic needs. I'm also not a big fan of forcing a girl to have a child just because she's pregnant. I think the girl should have the choice on whether to have the baby. After all, having a child is a lifelong commitment, and let's face it, the woman is the one that generally takes responsibility for the child while the men walk away. So at the end of the day, the woman should be the one to make the choice. I also feel like where fathers want to force women to birth their kids, that fathers should then have to take on the role as single parents financially and emotionally for the child once it's born. The moms could then hand over the babies to the fathers and walk away and live their lives, and the fathers would then be legally and morally able to take care of the child for the rest of their lives. I think that's a viable alternative. So, in some instances, pregnancy places a major strain on a woman's body and is very unhealthy for a woman and creates major health complications. In these instances, carrying the baby to term can pose serious health risks to the mom. The pro-lifers and the ban on termination of pregnancy means that the mom will die even if the pregnancy isn't viable. And I think that this is a serious flaw in the law, because why is one life more important than the other? Surely the woman's life is equally as important. I've attached a screenshot here which I got from amnesty.org with some shocking stats. Girls worldwide aged under 18 have been forced to have sex or perform sexual acts. This is 1 in 10 girls. The true number is probably higher. 40% of women of childbearing age live in countries where abortion is banned, restricted, or not accessible. 215 million women are not using contraception, even though they want to stop or delay having children. And this, in a lot of cases, is because the men in government are denying them access to contraception, once again in an effort to control the women's reproductive choices. Again, it's all about men and control. It's really time men stop making choices about women's bodies. In Burkina Faso, women can be refused contraceptives at health clinics unless they are accompanied by their husbands. In Algeria, Morocco, and Tunisia, laws fail to protect survivors of sexual violence. In some cases, rapists can avoid prosecution by marrying their victims, often teenage girls. It's disgusting. In Ireland, where abortion is illegal unless the woman's life is at serious risk, about 12 women a day travelled to the UK for a termination between 1980 and 2012. And in many countries, having sex outside of marriage, loving someone of the same gender, or simply dressing outside the social norm is enough to land you in jail. Can you believe that in a world in this year, we are still living with such antiquated views? It's unacceptable. Now, I've mentioned this before, but a lot of women actually are seriously at risk during pregnancy, and many have died due to anti-termination laws. I've listed a few here for you. One lady is Savita, who was in Ireland. She was 31 years old when she died of blood poisoning, nearly a week after she arrived at University Hospital Galway in Ireland, complaining of intense back pain. It's even more shocking that this happened in what is a first world country. Hala Panavar, a dentist from Karnataka in southwest India, was 17 weeks pregnant with her first child and went to hospital with her husband, Praveen, on Sunday the 21st of October 2012. Within hours, doctors said a miscarriage was inevitable, even though a fetal heartbeat could be heard. By this point, she was in unbearable pain and very upset, according to healthcare staff. The plan was she was told to wait and see if she would miscarry naturally. This was a failure in healthcare and should have had a legal case. At the time, Irish law stated that abortions were permitted only if there was a real and substantive threat to a woman's life, which there was. By Tuesday, there had been no miscarriage. The couple asked whether one could be induced, but were told by the doctor, under Irish law, if there's no evidence of risk to the life of the mother, our hands are tied as long as there's a fetal heartbeat. Hala Panavar developed a high fever. On the Wednesday morning, the medical team diagnosed infection and later septic shock. Her condition was deteriorating rapidly. A plan was made but not enacted to give Hala Panavar a drug to induce abortion. According to the Health Service Executive Inquiry, by this point the death of the fetus was certain, and the appropriate treatment was to terminate the pregnancy because of the risk to her life. She spontaneously miscarried mid-afternoon on Wednesday and was admitted to intensive care. She was now critically ill with severe sepsis and multiple organ failure. She suffered a cardiac arrest and died in the early hours of Sunday, 28th of October, almost a week after being admitted. Shocking. The case sparked outrage in Ireland and highlighted how the law puts women with life-threatening medical conditions at risk in Irish hospitals. The case sparked outrage in Ireland. As I mentioned, Halappana's husband revealed that he and his wife had repeatedly asked for the pregnancy to be terminated but had been refused and told, "This is a Catholic country." Protesters took to the streets calling for accountability and change, accusing the Irish state of failing to protect its citizens. An Amnesty International report in 2015 said her entirely preventable death was a consequence of Ireland's restrictive abortion laws. Anti-abortion campaigners said the case was being exploited by those with an agenda to liberalize Ireland's laws, and the Catholic Church declared that a woman had no more right to life than the fetus. I can't even believe that the Catholic Church said that. The government, under intense public scrutiny, carried out multiple inquiries into Halappana's death. In the HSE's final report, the investigation team stated that termination of pregnancy was medically indicated and would have been performed in other jurisdictions. In May 2018, Ireland voted by a landslide to repeal its near-total ban on abortion. The referendum, in which 66.4% voted yes, drew the highest turnout for a ballot on social issues. This woman's life could have been saved if people had been less ignorant. Then we look at Olga Reyes of Nicaragua. She was 22, waited in pain for hours at the hospital ward in 2006. She had been turned away from one hospital but arrived at the next one with the proof that she needed urgent care. An ultrasound scan from a private clinic showed an ectopic pregnancy was rupturing a fallopian tube. And if you're listening to this video, ectopic pregnancies are the reason why many women die. The fertilized egg had implanted itself outside of her womb, and the embryo at 6 weeks old could not survive, but was threatening her life. She was bleeding to death. Doctors delayed treatment, fearful of the repercussions of the ban on therapeutic abortions that had been introduced months earlier. In November 2006, by the time they took Reyes for surgery, it was too late. Let me note here that ectopic pregnancies are not viable pregnancies and the fetus cannot be saved. As soon as there's an ectopic pregnancy, the pregnancy is already not viable and needs to be terminated. The 22-year-old law student, who had celebrated her wedding only 2 months earlier, suffered repeated heart attacks during the operation and died from cerebral arrest due to hemorrhaging. In a report published the same year on the banning of therapeutic abortions in Nicaragua, the rights organization Human Rights Watch said she should have been treated immediately under government rules on ectopic pregnancies. But the contradictory new ban on therapeutic abortions meant doctors feared intervening. Only days after the law was changed, another young woman, the same age as Reyes, spent days asking for treatment from a local hospital without success. When she was transferred to another hospital, it was again too late. She died of a cardiac arrest. The mother's life is more important than the baby's. The baby cannot really survive without the mother, especially if the pregnancy is a risky pregnancy. We are now going to look at the case of Isabella of Poland. The morning before her death, Isabella texted her mother from the hospital. The child weighs 485 grams. For now, because of the abortion law, I have to stay in bed and they can't do anything, she wrote. They'll wait for the baby to die or for something to start happening. If it doesn't, then great, I can expect sepsis. Isabella owned a hair salon in a small town in Silesia. On her Instagram account, Pani Isa, as she was known to customers, would regularly post photos of her influencer-worthy wedding coiffures and hair transformation. Her clients did not spare compliments. The best hairdresser in the world. You can see she loves her job, reads one of the last online reviews dated June 2021, a month before Isabella died. Thanks to her, I went from black to blonde, and my hair survived. When her waters broke at 22 weeks, Isabella thought it was stress. She spent the day at hospital with her 9-year-old daughter who had fallen from her scooter. Isabella was taken to hospital the next day, though no treatment was undertaken until the next morning. They can't do anything, because then it'll look like they did it on purpose, she texted her mother to explain why doctors were not inducing the birth hours after the waters broke. They have to wait for it to happen on its own, and if it doesn't, then we're waiting for the heart to stop beating, she wrote. The woman is like an incubator, and the baby is suffering too. It has nothing to breathe with. So the woman, the mom in this case, and the child were both in pain and suffering, and because of these stupid laws, neither was provided with the relief that they needed to stop the suffering. Just think about that for a second. According to a Polish law introduced in 2021, abortion is legal to save the health or life of the mother and in cases where the pregnancy is a result of rape. Previously, the procedure could also be legally carried out in cases of severe fetal abnormalities. Although the doctors could have legally aborted, they chose not to until it was too late. The law that would have allowed them to do this was difficult to apply in practice, says Jolanta Budzowska, the lawyer representing Isabella's family in a court against the hospital. If they carry out an abortion too early and the prosecutors decide there was no danger to the mom, they can face up to 3 years in prison. Consequently, doctors are more cautious in their decisions. As doctors waited for the fetal heartbeat to stop, women on Isabella's wall recall her pleading with the staff. She felt that something was not right, but they kept telling her the heart is beating, and as long as the heart is beating, this is the way it must be. What a gross injustice to both mother and child. So what is the debate, people? The pro-life versus pro-choice debate tends to overlook the fact that the vast majority of women who have abortions don't do so by choice, at least not entirely. Circumstances put them in a position where abortion is the least self-destructive option available. According to a study conducted by the Guttmacher Institute, 73% of women who had abortions in the USA in 2004 said that they couldn't afford to have children. The most effective forms of birth control, even if used correctly, were only 90% effective in the late 20th century. Today, contraceptive options have improved, and even should they fail for some reason, individuals may take emergency contraception to prevent pregnancy. Advancements in birth control may help to further reduce the risk of unplanned pregnancies. Someday, abortion may grow increasingly rare in the USA, but for this to happen, individuals from all socioeconomic backgrounds and regions would need to have access to cost-effective and reliable forms of contraception. So, this is something that most people don't talk about, but there's a high number of women dying in childbirth. According to the latest UN Global estimates, 303,000 women a year die in childbirth, or as a result of complications arising from pregnancy. This means 830 women are dying each day, roughly 1 every 2 minutes. The majority of these deaths are from conditions that could have been prevented had women received the right medical care throughout their pregnancies and during birth. Severe bleeding and infections after childbirth are the biggest killers, but high blood pressure, obstructed labor, and unsafe abortions all contribute. Accurate maternal mortality figures require strong in-country data collections, which is often unavailable in developing countries, so the number of deaths is likely to be underreported. As women die in childbirth, men enact laws that deny them the rights over the bodies that they deserve. If men don't stop this, then women are just going to stop birthing babies because of the risk to a woman's health pregnancy causes. If you enjoyed this presentation, please could you consider liking, commenting, and subscribing to my channel. For future content, please keep an eye on my channel. Thank you and good night.